Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Claire Noble, the Program Manager for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. The Vail Symposium got its start in 1971, and shortly thereafter developed the motto, convening locally, thinking globally, which has served us well for nearly 50 years. While we cannot be here together this evening in the incomparable Vail, Colorado, we are so grateful that you've decided to convene with us tonight online. Tonight's topic is Brexit. Returning to update us on where the UK and the EU are in their divorce, Amanda Sloat. She'll be joined later with moderator Nick Fickling. Some program notes before we get started. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see an option for Q&A, and that's how you'll communicate with tonight's speaker. I'll monitor the Q&A and share your comments and questions later in the program, and it would be great if you could keep those as concise as possible. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It is being recorded, and the video will be available on the Vail Symposium website. Our sponsors are the Town of Vail, the Vail Daily, the Vail Resorts, Epic Promise Program, and the Antlers at Vail. And our virtual programs are underwritten by Alpine Bank. Thanks also to our generous underwriters underwriting the summer season, our Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Misher, and the Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. I'd also like to let you know about a program we have coming up on Thursday, August 6th. We'll welcome Ambassador Christopher Hill, and he'll discuss the nuclear ambitions and progress in both Iran and North Korea, as well as the US efforts to stop those programs. Well, 2016 was a year of notable populist victories, both in the United States presidential contest and in the UK, where voters chose to exit the European Union. And 4 years later, those negotiations between the UK and the EU continue. So let's find out what's been decided, what's still contested, and what to expect going forward. We're joined by expert Amanda Sloat, PhD. She's a Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. She is also a fellow with the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Southern Europe and Eastern Mediterranean Affairs at the State Department. She also served as Senior Advisor to the White House Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and Gulf region. As Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and as Senior Professional Staff on the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee. She holds a PhD in politics from the University of Edinburgh and a BA in political theory from James Madison College at Michigan State University. And she's the author of Scotland in Europe, a study of multi-level governance. Our moderator tonight is Nick Fickling. Nick served 26 years in the British Army, 2 of which he worked as an exchange officer in what is now the U.S. National Geospatial Agency. Towards the end of his career, he was assigned to run Joint Geographic Support to the U.S. CENTCOM Forward Headquarters in Riyadh. And since becoming a veteran, Nick has run an environmental not-for-profit, lobbied the British Parliament for the reduction of government control of geospatial data, and he's worked as a diplomat for the European Union in Republika Srpska. And since moving to Colorado in 1999, he's worked as a ski instructor, ski coach, and a college adjunct professor and tutor at Colorado Mountain College. And for those of you who know Nick, you know he is an accomplished athlete with awards too numerous to mention. But I will say that last Saturday, Nick won his age category in the 10K at 10,000 feet in Vail. But now I'd like to hand the program over to our speaker this evening, Amanda Sloat. Welcome, Amanda.
I thank you very much, Claire. It is a real pleasure to be back at the Vail Symposium, although I have to say I am incredibly sad not to be back in Vail in person this year. Facebook actually reminded me this morning that it was a year ago today that I was in Vail, and especially as the heat index in Washington hit 104 degrees today and there's more thunderstorms brewing outside, I am even more sad not to be enjoying the mountains of Colorado this week. But I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to participate in the symposium again and to provide an update on where things stand with the morass of Brexit. I would like to talk about three things really in general tonight that are interconnected. The first is to talk a little bit about the experience of coronavirus in the UK, which is obviously something that is being experienced around the world in addition to here in the United States. Second, give an update on where things stand with Brexit itself. And then third, talk a little bit about what's been happening in some of the UK's major foreign policy developments over the last couple of weeks in terms of China, which I think is giving some indication of where post-Brexit UK is going, and interestingly involves some of the same players that we saw within the Brexit debates. So starting out in terms of coronavirus, the UK has the dubious distinction of ranking first in Europe in terms of number of deaths and third in the world in terms of number of deaths. For quite a while, they were number 2 behind the United States, but they've now been surpassed by Brazil. I think we saw similar responses from the US and the UK to coronavirus. A lot has been made about having leaders of both countries that employed a populist style of politics, that had a somewhat dubious approach to the pandemic initially, and had a somewhat tenuous relationship with the science around it. The UK was further behind many of its continental neighbors in terms of imposing a lot of the lockdown restrictions. And it actually wasn't until March 23rd that Boris Johnson had announced a complete national lockdown. And that was after Scotland had taken steps. The Football League had decided to cancel matches, and a number of preemptive steps were taken. Now, the UK, similar to in the US, was guided by science, but they had a particular approach to the science, focusing on behavioral science. And what some of their government scientists were recommending was this idea at a very early stage of developing herd immunity, and also the idea of not locking down too quickly, because they were very concerned about quarantine fatigue, in the sense that people would get tired of being locked down and they wouldn't do it at a later stage when it was necessary. This approach, I think, is being seen to have been quite flawed, with some studies coming out suggesting that thousands of lives could have been saved if the government had locked down a week earlier. Boris Johnson also did not personally seem to take the virus very seriously, visiting hospitals, shaking hands with patients on COVID wards, bragging about it later in press conferences. And so as a result of all of that, it was not entirely a surprise when Boris Johnson himself succumbed to the coronavirus. He reportedly was extremely ill. He was in the hospital for about a week, including 3 nights in intensive care where he was placed on oxygen. And there really was a spirit of support for him within the nation, and people rallying around him, and thankfully he survived. Notably, his fiancée also got coronavirus, and 2 weeks after he got out of the hospital, she gave birth to their first child. The British institutions did continue throughout this time. The Queen gave a speech that rallied the nation. And also, interestingly, the Labour opposition party elected a new leader. One of the things I had talked about some when I was in Vail last year was that the Labour Party had been led by a fairly unpopular national leader in the form of Jeremy Corbyn. And that is partly what people attribute the very significant loss of the Labour Party to in December, when the Labour Party lost a very large number of seats in the elections. So as you'll recall, Theresa May stepped down as Prime Minister last summer after failing to get the Brexit deal through Parliament a number of times. After an internal leadership contest, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. He managed to tweak elements of the Brexit deal, in particular regarding Northern Ireland, and he managed to get agreement finally on his deal. He had elections in December where he had a resounding success. He ended up with an 80-seat majority in Parliament. You'll recall that Theresa May ended up losing the majority, and so when Boris Johnson took over, he was in the hole. And quite notably, he managed to capture some previous Labour stronghold seats in the northeast of England. So he started the year in a very strong position and then finally delivered on Brexit, with the UK formally leaving the EU at the end of January. So he was starting the year from a very powerful position, having finally delivered on Brexit, having a very large majority, and then of course the coronavirus hit. When the pandemic started, his popularity ratings were still very high. His government had a lot of support. The nation really rallied behind him when he was sick. However, that soon started to change, especially around the time when the government was starting to reopen. And just as their lockdown was bungled, their reopening of the country was also quite bungled. Boris Johnson also lost a huge amount of political capital over a scandal involving his senior political aide, Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings has long been with Boris Johnson, was seen as the mastermind of the Brexit Leave campaign, was also seen as the architect of a lot of the coronavirus rules, including these rules surrounding this behavioral science approach to the coronavirus. He became sick around the time that Boris Johnson did, and then a couple weeks later, his wife was ill. So he packed his wife and son into the car, drove up to the northeast of England, where they had family who could help care for the child in the event that his wife became seriously ill. On the face of this is understandable. The problem was this contravened the national guidance that had been set out for coronavirus. And so the person who wrote the guidance was seen to be flouting the guidance. There was then further controversy when he drove on his wife's birthday with his son to Durham Castle, which seemed like a nice family outing. He later claimed it was because coronavirus had affected his vision and he wanted to check his eyesight with a short 60-mile or so drive before taking the drive all the way back to London. So this combination of factors in terms of Boris Johnson's continued defense of Dominic Cummings and a lot of the botching of the reopening of the country significantly hurt Boris Johnson's political standing within the country after a very strong start at the beginning of the year. So in terms of shifting slightly to look at where we are with Brexit, the UK did formally leave the European Union on January 31st. What that meant in practical purposes was that the UK no longer has a voice in EU decision-making. There's no longer any British members of the European Parliament. British ministers do not participate in EU Council meetings, such as the one that happened last week to make decisions about the EU's 7-year budget, as well as some of its coronavirus funding for countries that were affected by that. And yet it remains bound by all of the EU's rules and by all of the EU's rights. So for a lot of UK citizens, they won't have noticed anything different in their lives. When they were still able to travel, they were still able to land on the continent and have the same benefits in terms of going through passport lines. Goods that are being traded from the UK into the EU continue to move the same way as they always have. And this is because what's been happening this year is an 11-month transition period that is supposed to give time to citizens and to businesses to prepare for this transition for when the UK is fully out of the European Union. During this 11-month period, the UK and the EU were also supposed to be setting out the parameters for their future relationship. The most significant part of this was negotiating a free trade agreement. So essentially setting out the economic rules that were going to guide relations between the two sides. This progress has been incredibly slow. The sides were not ready to start negotiating until the beginning of March. So 6 weeks after the UK left the European Union was when both of them had their negotiating platforms ready. The two negotiators had one meeting in person, and then the coronavirus set in. Michel Barnier, who's the EU's Brexit negotiator, succumbed to coronavirus himself, succumbed in that he got sick and then recovered. And the UK's negotiator also was ill, and then of course Boris Johnson was ill. So this really sidetracked talks for a while. Negotiators were also finding that it was very difficult to engage in serious negotiations over Zoom, and they were missing a lot of the ability to do that in person as they had done before. So there was a long pause in serious negotiations. They started up again recently, including engagement by Boris Johnson. The negotiators have had meals together in London as well as in Brussels. And just this week, the 5th round of negotiations on this free trade agreement ended up breaking up. Both sides put out statements that suggested some sort of continued hope for the process, but they also continued to acknowledge that they were very far apart and that they were continuing to engage in no deal planning. So it's unlikely that anything is going to happen in August as everybody moves into their summer holidays. And then the real crunch period is going to come in September and October. Everybody's been pretty clear that a deal needs to be reached by October because it then needs to be ratified by the European Parliament, by the British Parliament, and depending how comprehensive the agreement is, it may also need to be ratified by the 27 member state governments. And in some countries such as Belgium, that also requires approval by subnational parliaments. So all of this needs to be completed, including all of the ratification procedures, by December 31st. So the timing is extremely tight to get all of this done, especially given how far apart the two sides are. There's a number of areas in which they are far apart. One of them is a significant dispute over fisheries. The UK has been quite keen to remove a lot of the current fisheries rules that apply. The EU wants to maintain some sort of access to UK waters. The second has to do with state aid and fair competition. The EU is very concerned that because the UK is a close neighbor, they don't want them to have special advantages in terms of trade, being able to reduce tariffs, prices that they pay workers, prices of goods, which would end up giving the UK what they see as an unfair competitive advantage in terms of trade. The UK is saying, we want to negotiate a free trade agreement like you have with Canada, and you don't have those stipulations with Canada. The EU says Canada is much farther away, therefore is much less threatening in terms of a near competitor. There's also debates about the governance system. The EU would like to have the European Court of Justice maintaining some sort of judicial oversight when there are disputes. The UK is saying that because they are leaving the EU, they do not want to be bound by any of these provisions at all. So there's questions about whether or not this is going to be negotiated and whether or not they're going to be able to reach some sort of agreement in a quick period of time. One side note just to mention that has been coming out of both the coronavirus debates as well as the Brexit debates is the relationship between the UK government and Scotland. It was one of the things that we had talked about a lot last year as well in terms of the likely impact that Brexit is going to have on relations with Northern Ireland as well as with Scotland. With Northern Ireland, the fact that Boris Johnson reached an agreement that deals with the Irish border means that some of those tensions have decreased somewhat. However, coronavirus ended up re-inflaming some tensions when the British government and the Irish government took different approaches to coronavirus, which again left Northern Ireland in the middle. And there's also continued to be some disputes about the way that the mechanisms for implementing Brexit are actually going to work on the border in Northern Ireland. The EU has wanted to establish a presence in Northern Ireland to help manage this process. The UK government initially was balking. Boris Johnson was denying what was in the agreement that he reached with the EU, which suggested there would be some checks on goods moving east-west, so from Great Britain itself over to Northern Ireland, if those goods were going to continue into the Republic. He's at least backed off his opposition somewhat and acknowledged that there will need to be some checks. So that is going to continue to remain a flashpoint in this process. The bigger concern that people have now is the relationship with Scotland. And Boris Johnson actually was in Scotland today, which was his first trip there since the December election. There's increasing nervousness in London about what is happening in Scotland, particularly growing support for the independence movement. There was polls that came out in the last couple of days that showed support for independence in Scotland has now reached 54%. So there has been fairly consistent polling in the near term showing that support is now over this 50% benchmark, suggesting that if there was going to be a referendum, there was going to be growing support in Scotland for that. The other number that's concerning to the government in London is that 55% of those in Scotland believe that Boris Johnson has handled the pandemic badly. So Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, the head of the Scottish government, had the right to implement policies differently in Scotland. And so they ended up having restrictions for longer. They had more restrictive measures in place. And as a result, they have had less cases than what there has been in England. So the Scottish National Party also is in a very strong position going into Scottish elections next May. So all of this is making London quite concerned about the future of the union and what the implications of that are going to be. The final thing that is inflaming tensions between Scotland and England is that a large amount of the policies that the EU had authority for are now being returned to the UK as a result of Brexit. When the Scottish Parliament was set up, the legislation said that a small number of issues were going to be reserved to the central government. So it's very similar to the federal system we have here in the US, where Washington is responsible for immigration policy, for national security, for defense, and then states, as we've seen with the coronavirus, have the authority over things like education, roads, decisions on masks, et cetera. And it's the same in the UK. The thing that's complicated is of those things that were not reserved and were devolved to Scotland, many of those powers had been held by the EU itself. And so now that those powers are coming back to the UK, there is a question of where those powers lie. So it's things like fisheries, agriculture, and the environment. Scotland is saying these powers were devolved, we should have a say over them. The UK government is saying, wait a minute, we can't have 4 different agriculture regimes, environmental regimes, and fishing regimes. Scotland's replying that that's a power grab. You are taking powers that should rightfully be ours. And so this is becoming a very sensitive constitutional issue that is going to have to be handled carefully by the British government, or it is going to continue to inflame these independent sentiments that we're seeing in Scotland. Boris Johnson has long maintained that the Scottish independence referendum that was held in 2014 was a once-in-a-generation event, and therefore he does not support giving the Scots the right to vote a second time. The Scots have argued that because of Brexit, it makes it a qualitatively different situation, and therefore they should have the opportunity to get a second vote. If the Scottish National Party does well in May elections next year, I think this call for a second referendum is going to continue. Let me just say a brief word now about China, because we have been seeing a number of developments within the UK over the last number of weeks on China. And Secretary of State Pompeo was just in London earlier this week as part of his big push in Europe on the issue of China. COVID showed the UK, and I think a number of Europeans, the degree of dependence that they had on China in terms of getting pharmaceuticals from them, in terms of getting PPE, in terms of manufacturing, and this was causing a degree of discomfort in the country. People also were very concerned about some of the heavy-handed measures that China has taken in recent weeks. There was already concern about the treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority in China. There was debate over the situation with Huawei, the technology company. And then there was particular concern over China's decision in recent weeks to implement this national security law in Hong Kong. And that, I think, really was the final straw for a lot of people in the UK. Hong Kong, of course, had long been a British colony. It was handed over by the Brits back to China in 1997. And there were certain agreements reached between China and the UK that anticipated keeping this autonomous status of Hong Kong. And people in the UK felt that this national security law violated that. As a result, the UK has done a number of things. First, it offered a pathway of citizenship for up to 3 million people in Hong Kong to come to the UK. Personally, I find this somewhat extraordinary given that so many of the Brexit debates had to do with issues of immigration and the UK wanting to reassert control over its borders and being concerned about the number of Europeans that were moving to the UK. Now, arguably, the UK does not believe that upwards of 3 million people are going to move there, but it was still a fairly significant immigration decision taken by the British government that seems to have received fairly widespread support. Second, and most significantly, the British government has reversed its decision on Huawei. Boris Johnson had announced at the beginning of the year that it was going to allow Huawei to develop part of its 5G internet infrastructure within the country. Now that Brexit has happened, Boris Johnson is very focused, or certainly was before the coronavirus interfered with some of those plans, in developing a very robust domestic system, investing a lot of money in the infrastructure, and part of that was getting broadband internet across the country. And so building on some of the existing Huawei technology was seen as being part of that. In the last week or two, he has reversed that and has said he is not going to let Huawei build further infrastructure, and also wants to remove existing Huawei infrastructure by 2027. Earlier this week, the UK also ended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong. There was a concern that if it extradited people back to Hong Kong, they might get sent to China where they would not have fair trials. Pompeo was in London this week, continuing to push for more, especially on the military side. And this creates a really difficult balancing act for the UK. On one hand, they want to remain on good terms with the US, especially because they want to negotiate a free trade agreement with the US. The initial hope had been that an agreement could be reached by this July, which they believed would then put pressure on the European Union. This week, both sides have acknowledged that is not going to happen, and it is very unlikely that anything is going to get agreed before the US election. Trump was always going to be a tough negotiator going into this, and trade, of course, remains a very sensitive issue in the United States, especially when it comes to questions of animal welfare, environmental issues, things that the UK objects to in terms of genetically modified foods, chlorine washed chickens, but things that the United States was going to hold firm to in order to be able to protect its own farmers and agricultural sector. So while the UK made some of these decisions, it's trying to be seen as not bowing to Washington's wishes or Trump's wishes on this, but having done it for its own domestic political interests. Final point on this, and to bring it back to Brexit, a lot of the hardline Brexiteers within the Conservative Party had formed the ERG, the European Research Group, and that had driven a lot of these debates. Many of them are now members of what's known as the China Research Group. And so I think a large part of the reason that Boris Johnson made the decisions that he did on Huawei and on China have to do with domestic politics, and in particular, this pressure that he was getting from the backbench of the Conservative Party. They are now pushing for the UK to take even stronger measures, including removing China from any of the nuclear plants that are being built in the UK, and also wanting to take a look at the over 100,000 Chinese students that have been studying in the UK. So this is the first element now of the UK being able to set out its own foreign policy in terms of things like immigration rules, decisions on Huawei, which may now put pressure on Germany to follow in similar footsteps, in addition to some of the complex trading arrangements that the UK is going to have to take into account, as they are far from having an agreement with the EU. They are far from having an agreement with the US, and they want to maintain robust trading links with China without becoming too dependent on them or overly irritating them as a result of this Huawei decision, as well as engagement with the US on this issue. So I've talked for a long time in my opening comments, so let me stop there. I will also say there is lots of thunder and lightning outside here in Washington, so hopefully I do not lose power and get disconnected. But Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you very much for that very clear and comprehensive brief. I'm sorry we're not meeting in person, and I'm particularly sorry that we're not meeting for dinner afterwards, because I really enjoyed listening to you give more after our last chat, and I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this with you again tonight. One thing you didn't cover was Russia, and so I'll dig straight into Russia. Did Russia interfere in the Brexit vote? Is there evidence to confirm it did? And if so, to what purpose? This week we read report that the British government didn't even look into it, or the agencies that should have done didn't. And so they've really got no idea. What do you think? How big is Johnson's debt to Putin? And does he fear that evidence would not only delegitimize the vote that got his party elected and him elected, but also leave a stain on him personally? How can UK neutralize Russian misinformation and mischief going forward with maybe a vote in Scotland or whatever? What do you say to that?
Well, thank you. I think it's an excellent question, and you're right. I did not touch on that. It's been a big week in many ways in British politics, with the Brexit negotiations going on, Pompeo's visit, and then of course this Russia report was a final piece of that. So to provide a little bit of context for those who may not have been following that, there was a parliamentary inquiry into this question of Russian interference, and the initial plan had been for it to be released last fall or winter in advance of the election in December. Boris Johnson had gotten Parliament to slow roll that report, and so there was a lot of criticism in December that this report was not published in advance of the election. Then it took some time to get the committee stood up after the election in December, and so as you said, this report finally came out this week. And it does not look very positive for the government. One of the things that comes out that's very clear is that there is a large number of Russian oligarchs who have moved to London. Many of them have subsequently acquired British citizenship, who have been giving large amounts of money to the Conservative Party. So that's not necessarily something that Boris Johnson would have wanted to have come out in the days and weeks before the election, which is that you've got a large number of Russian oligarchs bankrolling the party. So that was one thing. Second, and I think one of the things that grabbed headlines was that there was indication of Russian interference in Scotland's 2014 independence referendum in terms of disinformation that was there. In response to your question, the report was not clear on whether or not there was Russian interference in the 2016 Brexit referendum. And one of the big critiques it made was the fact that the government had not taken this more seriously and looked at it more seriously. There seemed to be a lot of mixed wires within the intelligence community in terms of who was responsible for looking at what aspects of this. There was questions about why the government didn't look into it more seriously. There's been a lot of media reporting in the UK, including by a Guardian journalist, Carol Caldwaller, raising questions about Russian interference, and in particular, Russian bankrolling of the Leave campaign, that it was suggesting that the government was not looking into either. Just anecdotally, I had raised this question with British officials a number of times over the last year or two and asked them whether or not they thought Russia had interfered. And I was always a little bit surprised at how dismissive of this they were. Their approach to it seemed to be similar to Donald Trump's reaction to this question of Russian interference in the 2016 election, which is that if you acknowledge there was some interference, it somehow invalidates the result, in our case of the 2016 election and in the UK of the Brexit referendum. And what British officials would say was that there was enough legitimate disagreement with the European Union that even if there had been some Russian targeting or some ads, they didn't believe it sufficiently changed voters' will on that. Whether or not that's true is a matter of debate, but what is certainly clear coming out of this report is that the Conservative government did not take these concerns sufficiently seriously to actually launch a full investigation into the question. But in terms of what Putin gains from this, I think if you end up having Scotland leaving the UK, you've got the UK leaving the EU, you've got one of Europe's major powers, a UN Security Council seat holder, a nuclear power, a very strong military, consumed internally and in a state of domestic disarray, which really limits its ability to engage more internationally. And in terms of Britain's attitudes toward Russia, I think it really took until the Skripal poisonings a couple of years ago for the government to start looking more seriously at what Russia was potentially doing within the UK itself.
Thank you. That's very enlightening. I'm particularly interested in the latter comments you are making there. I have a confession. I was brought up in the west of Scotland in my formative years. I have 3 grandsons who are living with my daughter and son-in-law in Scotland at the moment, and they're very Scots. So my next questions are all about Scotland and Northern Ireland. What is your sense of the strength of the Scottish independence movement? 54% are for leaving at the moment, it seems, by the polls. But there's another aspect, which is the vacuum in Europe of a financial center, when London possibly is not accepted by Europe, and people are looking at Frankfurt, they're looking at maybe the Netherlands, they're looking at Paris, they're looking at Dublin. Would Edinburgh be a candidate if they left the United Kingdom and stayed in Europe? Because they're English speaking, and I like Scotland.
Yes, well, as you know, Scotland is very near and dear to my heart. I lived there for 3 years. I did my PhD there, looking at the question of Scotland's relationship with the UK and the EU. And if nothing else, it's very gratifying to have what seemed like a very obscure PhD subject at the time become relevant in a lot of these debates 20 years later. You know, there always, and you will know this better than I, but there always has been a live discussion about independence within Scotland. You know, ever since the Union of 1707, there has been a segment of people that has felt like they've been under English oppression. And certainly whenever there is a conservative government in London, it tends to inflame that. There was a big sense of frustration in the late 70s, the early 80s, particularly under Margaret Thatcher, who was seen as very unpopular, especially with her introduction of the poll tax in the country. And that fueled a lot of this desire in Scotland that they were being dictated to by the English and by a government that they didn't necessarily vote for. When Tony Blair came in 1997, the first thing he did was legislate for devolution, for setting up a Scottish parliament and devolved governments in Wales and Northern Ireland. Theresa May ended up winning back some support from the Scottish National Party, and then Boris Johnson lost it again quite significantly in this December election. So I was actually just reading an article in the Scotsman this morning saying that Boris Johnson is fairly universally disliked within Scotland. Scots disliked Margaret Thatcher, but they at least respected her, whereas Boris Johnson, they don't like and they don't respect. The fact that this is now the first time he is going up there since the election, the fact that coronavirus was handled differently. It's also important to remember in the Brexit referendum, 63% of people in Scotland voted to stay in the EU. And so this is fueling the fact that yet again, the English are dictating something to them that is not what they chose themselves. So you then start to get in discussions about whether or not an independent Scotland would join the European Union. Scotland only has 5 million people. Some people question if that's too small for it to be an independent country. They of course point to countries like Ireland and others that have done fine as independent countries. There had long been questions about whether the EU would let an independent Scotland join. There had been concerns by countries like Spain that don't want to fuel their own independence movements by letting newly independent countries join. Again, I think there's a sense that with Brexit, the question is qualitatively different because the UK had already left the EU. Scotland would then become independent and seek to rejoin. Another one of the questions that keeps coming up about Scottish independence has to do with the economics. There was a school of thought a number of years ago that Scotland would be able to make a significant amount of money off oil that was found off the north coast of Scotland. But now that oil prices are depressed globally, it makes the economic case a little bit more difficult than what it was before. But all of that said, I do think that there is clearly growing support for this. We're seeing it in the polls, which have now ticked above 50% for the first time. The referendum in 2014 maxed out at around 48%. So we are now consistently seeing more than half. And I think a lot of this is going to continue to be fueled by the repercussions of coronavirus, the repercussions of Brexit. Scotland is a much more rural area than much of England. They depended a lot on migrant labor from Central and Eastern Europe that they are now losing. They've always had much stronger ties to the continent and a much more open attitude toward Europe. That is going to be fueling things. This constitutional debate over where power lies is going to be continuing to fuel that as well. To respond to your second question, yeah, I mean, I think Scotland could make a case very similar to what Ireland has done, that it could be an attractive place to do business. You have an English-speaking population, although I will say it took me some time to adjust the Scottish accents, especially on the west of the country. But nominally, you have an English-speaking population. You have a well-educated population. Ireland, for example, has done very well with high tech, with call centers, with a lot of businesses that are moving there that want to be still within Europe. And so Scotland has also been very forward-leaning in terms of promoting an independent policy and trade promotion. They have offices in Brussels, they have an office in Washington, they opened offices in Canada, in parts of Asia. And so the Scots have always been very international looking, and I think even more so now are wanting to establish an identity that is distinct from the rest of the UK and to ensure that their political and economic interests are being taken into account.
Thank you. Go Scotland. If I could move to Northern Ireland, it seems that to me that COVID-19 and Brexit have had a sort of unifying effect on the whole of Ireland. And I remember last year that in the Irish Republic provided the winner of the Shane Lowry of the British Open, which was held in Portrush, a Protestant area of Northern Ireland. And yet everybody was cheering. All of Ireland was cheering. Ireland has, people probably don't realize this, but Ireland has a rugby team that covers the whole of the country. It's not Northern Ireland rugby team and an area rugby team, it's one for the whole of Ireland. It seems to me that de facto, Ireland already is united. And I'm interested with that as a background, what your comments are on the prospects for a customs arrangement with Northern Ireland. Really, isn't it, if you know the Northern Irish border, it follows parish boundaries and it's convoluted. It goes through the centres of buildings and it goes through pubs and you can roll a pint of beer down the bar. And the beer travels from one country to another. Would you please address Northern Ireland's special status and the EU's idea to have an office in Belfast?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So I also lived in Northern Ireland for 3 years. It's where I did my postdoc, and I used to, sorry, there's like very dramatic flashes of lightning outside. I always used to take the bus from Belfast down to Dublin, and you wouldn't even know that you would cross the border. I mean, it was like crossing a state line in the US. The only way that you knew things were different was because you would see signs in euros, you would see signs in Gaelic, speed limits would be in kilometers rather than miles, but otherwise everything would essentially look very similar, and there was no border checks there. That, of course, was largely a result of the Good Friday Agreement, a decision to take down a lot of the customs and security infrastructure that had been on the border. And you're absolutely right that people were saying that to try and demarcate that border would be extremely difficult. It passed through people's farms, cows would wander back and forth. with, and similarly to Americans that live very close to state lines, you know, gas might be cheaper across state lines. You might, in Washington, for example, a lot of people live in Virginia and then drive into DC to work. And so suddenly having border infrastructure would be very inconvenient. And then also given the psychological legacy of the Troubles, it would be very psychologically destabilizing. This whole question of Northern Ireland had been the biggest challenge for Theresa May in terms of trying to get her deal through. And that was due in large part to the fact that she did not have a majority of Conservative MPs. Her government was propped up by 10 members of the Democratic Unionist Party, which was the hardline Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. And so what Boris Johnson was able to do was renegotiate the Brexit deal and then win a large enough majority that he did not depend on Northern Ireland anymore and to try and get it through. So what Theresa May had done was negotiate what was known as a backstop. And so it said if the UK and EU did not reach agreement, then Northern Ireland would stay in the EU's customs union. Northern Ireland DUP didn't like that. It was then applied to the entire UK that all of the UK would stay in the customs union. The hardline Brexiteers did not like that. So what Boris Johnson did was essentially revert back to a form of the backstop, but rather than having it be a backstop insurance policy, it actually became built into the agreement. So what the agreement now says with Brexit is that the entire UK leaves the EU's customs union and single market, but it says that Northern Ireland is going to remain aligned with the customs union and also aligned with VAT agreements. So in many ways, for all intents and purposes, they're essentially going to remain a part of it. And that's why you now are back to this situation where in order to avoid border checks moving north-south on the island, which would require this intrusive infrastructure, you're going to have border checks on goods that are moving east to west, from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, from Northern Ireland into Great Britain. And the main concern for that is say, for example, the UK strikes a trade deal with the United States and wants to import our chlorinated chicken. Their factories then put chlorinated chicken in microwave meals. Those microwave meals get sent to Northern Ireland, which then gets sent to the Republic of Ireland, which then gets sent to France. That is not something that the EU wants because they don't want America's chlorinated chicken. And so you would need to check those goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland to ensure that they stayed in Northern Ireland and they didn't actually move elsewhere within the European Union. So there's lots of complexities that have to be worked out in terms of the checks on these goods. They're primarily going to do them at seaports rather than at land crossings on the island. You need to work out what happens if the tariff rates between the EU and the UK differ in terms of ensuring that manufacturers get rebates on some of these tariffs. So there's a lot of modalities that need to be worked out, which is part of the reason why the EU wanted to have a representation office in the north to be able to help supervise some of these policies. You also, of course, have people living in Northern Ireland that as a result of the Good Friday Agreement had the right to either get Irish or British passports. And so you're gonna have a large number of people living in Northern Ireland that have Irish passports and that are EU citizens and are gonna want to ensure that their rights are also protected under the EU. And in terms of the sports questions you raised, I was always very confused about, I was confused about why Australia was in the Eurovision Song Contest. I was confused about why they competed as the home nations in some sports and as you said in rugby for whatever reason, unlike in football, they competed as a unified island. The last question just on that is, you know, there's been questions about whether or not Scotland would become independent. There's also been questions about whether Northern Ireland would eventually reunify with the Republic of Ireland. The polling has not shown that there is majority support for that yet. If you look just demographically, the Catholics population is growing at a larger rate than the Protestant population is in Northern Ireland. You will at a certain point reach a moment where there is more Catholics than Protestants, but it does not necessarily follow that all Catholics are nationalists who want to join Ireland. So I think this is not something that's likely to happen in the short term, but I do think in the medium term, we are likely to see a trend going in that direction. And if we continue to have a badly implemented Brexit, if we continue to have additional strains like we did with coronavirus, where the two governments are implementing policies differently, it could continue to affect how people there feel about the constitutional status of the region.
Thank you, Amanda. I need to stop hogging your time. I have lots more questions, but I need to hand back to Claire, who I know wants to open it up to a wider audience. So thank you very much.
Nick, thank you so much. So yes, we have a number of questions, and if you're in the audience and you have a question for us this evening, you can use the Q&A to ask your questions. So the first question comes from Donald Crook, and he asks, how will trade between the UK and the EU be handled if no trade agreement is reached by December 31st?
So the very short and simple answer to that is that the UK and the EU will return to trading on WTO rules. So right now, under the customs union and the single market, they operate as a single space. Again, the same way as trade between Virginia and Colorado. It's all one market, and goods flow freely. If there is no trade agreement reached, then it goes back to WTO terms, which on some goods are going to impose very steep tariffs on things. The UK government is already saying that it will cover the costs of some of those tariffs for the first couple of months to try and soften the blow for some of the industries, but it is certainly going to make some goods much more expensive in the UK, and it is also going to require a very large number of checks at the border to be able to implement all of those tariffs. So I think for many businesses in the UK, that is a situation that they want to avoid. They would like to be in a place where they are able to trade on preferential terms. The one thing I should add on this trade question was that Boris Johnson had the possibility at the end of June to ask for an extension to this transition period of either 1 to 2 years, which would have allowed more time for negotiation. Boris Johnson did not want to delay Brexit in the first place. He was very clear that he did not want to delay the end of this transition period, partly because it was his main campaign promise. He does not want to have to pay further money into EU coffers, and he doesn't want to remain subject to EU rules anymore. My own personal view is that if the UK leaves at the end of the year without a trade arrangement in place, it is going to be a significant economic shock to a country that is already in a deep recession because of the coronavirus. There is another school of thought in the UK that says because the UK is in such an economic mess anyway because of coronavirus, the additional pain caused by a no-deal withdrawal would be negligible, and that the government could simply blame the economic pain on the coronavirus, and people wouldn't necessarily be able to differentiate between that and an EU-imposed additional shock.
Okay.
If I could add one quick thing, which is that the bureaucracy that will be created, the bureaucratic nightmare that will be created for businesses and for the government and for people working at the border and so forth is going to be a nightmare.
For sure.
So Lauren Hershey is asking, what happens within and to the Commonwealth as a result of Brexit?
So the Commonwealth itself is not affected by this. The UK, of course, maintained relationships with its Commonwealth countries while it was a member of the EU, and that is going to continue. So there is no immediate change. One potential change that we're going to see, and it's part of the reason I wanted to highlight the situation with Hong Kong, is that the UK may seek to deepen some of its relationships with its Commonwealth partners. So, for example, extending this offer of 3 million people from Hong Kong being able to come as citizens is one thing that they would not have been able to do if they were in the EU. It also seems quite likely, and in fact is already starting, that the UK is going to be reaching out to some of its wealthier Commonwealth partners to try and reach free trade agreements with them. So there's already conversations starting with New Zealand, with Australia, and with Canada. The question is going to be whether some of those countries are going to want to have citizenship benefits on top of that. And so whether in exchange for some of these free trade arrangements, the UK again is going to have to allow a certain number of people from these Commonwealth countries to be able to move and live in the UK.
I'm listening to the sound effects from your microphone. It sounds like you're under attack there. So Bob Rush has a question for you. wouldn't it be in the current US administration's interest to make a trade deal with Britain? Or does Britain think it can make a better deal with a new administration, with the Biden administration?
It's a good question. I think the Trump administration, I think, certainly was keen to negotiate some sort of deal with the UK. And I think, as with the EU, if the UK wanted to accept a lot of the provisions that the Demandeur was making, then I think it would have been quite quick and easy. It's like the apocalypse outside, which is par for the course in 2020 here in Washington. The reality is that I think some of the US lines are likely to remain similar because any sort of trade deal needs to get through Congress. I think that's going to be extremely difficult to do in an election year. A lot of these agriculture provisions are going to hold. Arguments on these environmental standards are going to hold. I think there had been some hope initially that because Trump and Johnson had a good personal relationship, that Trump was very interested in having a trade deal, that Johnson certainly wanted a trade deal to prove the benefits of Brexit, that it might be quite quick to be able to get that pushed through. There are going to be questions, I think, with Biden coming in terms of whether or not he is going to want to do trade deals right off the bat. He certainly has been campaigning about concern for American industry, about wanting to rebuild things at home. And so I'm not sure that Biden is going to want to be quite quick in terms of negotiating free trade agreements right off the bat either. Then there's the congressional piece. And I think especially for members of Congress, there's also going to be a lot of questions about the handling of the border in Northern Ireland. The bigger challenge, I think, in all of this, and I think I raised this last summer as well, is that the UK ultimately needs to decide how it wants to align itself in regulatory terms. It can't have different environmental and agricultural standards with the US and with the EU. And so in some ways, to me, because the EU is its nearest neighbor and its biggest trading partner, it would make sense to get those details hammered out first and then be able to negotiate with other countries from a position of actually knowing what that trade relationship is going to look like.
Okay, since we're on the topic of trade, I'd like to share with you a question from John Sharkis. He asks, how will the US and UK create an open trade policy globally without China and Russia intervention?
It's a very good question, and I don't have a strong enough background in global economics to have a good answer to that. But I think there's a lot of broader discussion happening about what to do with these multilateral institutions generally. China, of course, is part of the UN Security Council. We've had a lot of disputes with China within the WTO. There is concern, especially within Europe, about the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the World Health Organization. The argument that comes from Europe is that if the US pulls out of these international institutions, it makes it harder for Europeans to fight back against Chinese influence in them. And so I think the challenge with all of this is the US committed to a multilateral system? Are there things that can be done to sustain things within the system that are working? And then what do we need to do to look at some of the broader challenges that make these systems not work as well for others, especially for developing economies, and try and reform them accordingly? But personally, I feel like withdrawing from these institutions is not the way to do it, and tends to cede space to both China and Russia to have a stronger influence.
Now for something totally different, and this will be our last question of the evening. Lori Kleisinger wants to know, what do you mean by chlorinated chicken?
So Nick is a good Brit, I'm sure would have views on this as well. I find if you want to make a Brit shudder, all you need to do is mention chlorinated chicken, and that will do the trick. So apparently American poultry producers tend to wash their chicken with a chlorine wash between killing the chicken and then sending it to the supermarkets for you to be able to purchase. As I understand it, the argument is that as a way of getting rid of any of the bacteria that would be in the chicken. For many Europeans, they believe this is just symbolic of the fact that Americans are raising their chickens in poor conditions and that the chickens are so poorly kept that they need to be cleansed with some sort of chlorine wash. I think critics of this will show that there are similar washing practices within Europe, and this is simply old-fashioned protectionism by Europe. But you will often see this come up in articles about US and UK debates on this. You know, sort of the more highbrow term for this is talking about animal welfare standards, but really sort of the tabloid version in the UK is chlorinated chicken. So Nick, I don't know if your palate has been suffering greatly by being subjected to American chlorine washed chicken after eating the purer stuff growing up in the UK, but that is one of the big sticking points in these bilateral trade discussions.
I try to avoid chlorinated. I try to avoid chicken, to be honest. But I've got a comment to make, which is that I read recently that one of the biggest contributors to Donald Trump's campaign is a big chicken king. And so my question, Amanda, would be, is the deal, possible deal between Britain and the United States going to be heavily influenced by people who have a vested interest?
I think any sort of bilateral trade deal is going to have agriculture as a sticking point. Tariffs between the US and the UK are already fairly low. I mean, we already have a relatively open trading system between us. There is less agriculture trade already simply because it's a long way to be able to be shipping some of these animal products. If you look at trade negotiations that the US was having with the EU and TTIP negotiations, there was concern about French agricultural subsidies. So if you want to look at the areas where you would reduce current barriers to trade, agriculture is always going to be one of them. And I think this whole debate around chlorine washed chicken has been around for a while. Like I said, another area has been genetically modified foods, which the EU has regulated against. The UK will need to decide if that's something that they want to stay in or not. So, the degree to which Trump is influenced by that particular donor, I'm not sure, but I do suspect both for any administration and also for members of Congress from heavily farm-oriented states, this question of protectionism and animal subsidies and farming subsidies is going to be a significant component of any sort of trade negotiation.
Amanda, Nick, thank you both for joining us this evening, and thanks for bringing us up to date on Brexit, which in some cases seems like we haven't really made much progress. But thank you both, and thank all of you for joining us on our webinar this evening, and I hope you'll join us on August 6th when we welcome Ambassador Christopher Hill. Again, thank you all, and good night.
Thank you.
Good night, thank you.